Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Sneezing Derek here today. Just had a little episode. Guess there's something in the air as we finally make it into summer in the Pacific Northwest. We're almost there. None of you who live in the lower 48 would believe it. I should say the lower 47 would believe it. But as I look right now, it is 63 degrees outside at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So, sorry for those of you who are sweltering, but trust me, we've endured a lot of cloudy, rainy weather to get these cool summer days that everybody comes to visit during. Anyway, that has nothing to do with today's episode, and I just promised I'd be efficient, and here I go again. Oh well. Today's episode is a continuation in the George Macdonald for Every Generation series, and it's a unique one. I've got a returning guest and a new guest, and they are united by family, father and daughter. Joining me is Jenni Cannariato, who you have already heard in the episode with her husband Thomas on George Macdonald. And Jenni, as I mentioned in the previous episode, is a freelance editor and spends her days raising 3 rambunctious and creative boys. And she helps authors of all backgrounds polish and develop their writing. If she has any time remaining, you can find her reading a good book, lingering over a cup of coffee with her husband, or whipping up something tasty in the kitchen. Joining Jenni and I is her father, Erik Ritschard. Erik is a lifetime educator who's taught just about every subject offered. He now serves as head of school at Grace Cascade Christian Schools in Medford, Oregon. Erik and his wife Jani enjoy dogs, goats, working at school, getting out to the coast, if you've been to the Oregon coast, you know why, as often as possible, and of course rereading George Macdonald from time to time. Both consider their 5 children and 8 grandchildren among their greatest joys and blessings, and both point to Jesus as their perfect father and good shepherd. I'm so grateful that you're listening to us today. And if you're in a hot part of this country, find some AC and relax. And I'm thankful to Erik and Jenni for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. We had a father and son duo earlier in our C.S. Lewis Great Divorce series. We are now having a father-daughter duo joining us as we talk about George Macdonald for Every Generation. And joining me is Erik Ritschard and his daughter, Jenni Cannariato. It's great to have you guys.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Awesome. I'd love for you guys just to share briefly kind of where you're at in the world, what you're up to, what your day-to-day looks like. We'll start with you, Erik.
Sure, yeah. I'm currently serving as head of schools at Grace Cascade Christian Schools down here in Medford, Oregon. And so that's pretty consuming, pretty occupying, although the school schedule's great. So I've just had a couple of weeks time with some family and celebrating the holidays. So
Nice.
5 kids, multiple dogs and other animals running about the place.
And grandchildren, I understand?
Yes, 7 with us now and 1 on the way. So
Wow.
we feel very blessed. Yeah.
That's amazing. Is your school K through 12?
Yeah, preschool through 12, about 750 kids all together, 2 campuses. It's a circus that's a ton of fun.
And how long have you been there?
This is just my 4th year. I'm relatively new there.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Well, hopefully some of George Macdonald's wisdom guides you as you steer the course there.
Yeah, we can talk about that in a minute.
And Jenni, what does your day-to-day world look like these days?
Yeah, so I'm a stay-at-home, work-at-home, homeschooling mom of 3 boys. So my life is equally circus, just on a smaller scale. We have a 7-year-old, 4-year-old, and 5-month-old, and they are lots of fun and super high energy and pull out the best and the worst in us every day that we're always learning. So it's super fun. I've really been enjoying getting into the homeschool world. My oldest is in 2nd grade, so I haven't been doing that super long, but it's been a lot of fun. And then on the side, in the wee corners, I do freelance editing. So I get to work with words and help writers hone their craft, which is also equally a lot of fun, just with a different part of my brain.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about like the genre or the type of client you help?
Just that there is none. I've done truly a little bit of everything. Current clientele include businesses and all of their collateral. So marketing collateral, internal collateral, all of that. To novelists, I also work for a curriculum company editing their work. And so I've done everything. Oh, and students. So dissertations and thesis papers. So that in and of itself covers basically every topic. And then I've gotten to do fun book projects from fantasy to nonfiction, theology, like spy novels. It exposes me to a lot. It's a
Wow.
lot of fun. Yeah,
That's fun. You have like an alternate reality happening at all times in the background, right?
basically so, yes. Yes.
That's a lot of fun. Well, as I mentioned before, this series is exploring the ways in which the thought of George MacDonald can be helpful to people at every stage of life, all the way from childhood to aging and dying. It's driven out of a passion that I have as a newcomer, relatively newcomer, to the work of MacDonald. Less than 10 years now that I've been diving into his thought and his stories and his unspoken sermons, his poetry. And I'm a bit envious, Erik, because apparently you and George have been companions for a lot longer than that. And so my first question to both of you, but I want to start with Erik because I think he introduced MacDonald to you, Jenni, as a fantastic father. You've got brownie points there. I wish I had had George when my kids were small. How did you come across George MacDonald, Erik?
Yeah, that goes back a little more than 40 years. When I was a senior in college, my wife and I had gotten married that summer. A friend of a friend, we were sitting around talking, and she was talking about George MacDonald, recommended that I give a book to my wife. I don't think she thought I was smart enough to enjoy it. I think. So give it to your wife. So I did. I picked up The Fisherman's Lady. Those were the days when Michael Phillips was getting going with his editing series. So picked up a copy of that, and she read it, said she really enjoyed it, and that launched our journey. And I read it. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank you, Erik. That's.
yeah.
I'm curious, just briefly, a little bit about the first book you read. I don't know that I've heard of that MacDonald story.
Well, I'm not sure what the original title was. Most of my frame of reference is around Michael Phillips.
No, it's a set of two books called The Fisherman's Lady and The Marquis's Secret in Michael Phillips' editing world. And I'm not sure of the original titles either because it's been a while since I've read them as well. But that was the first book that Michael Phillips released in his editing series was The Fisherman's Lady. I think is why that specific book was recommended to you even because it was maybe the first one available at the time or only.
Yeah, they had been out. They had been out just a little bit, but really accessible first story. A little heavier on story, a little lighter on theology. Maybe a great place to start, and a pretty solid, romantic mystery going on. So fun to read, easily accessible, gets you into the Scottish dialect a little bit as edited by Mr. Phillips. And yet right away you begin to see the diamond that is MacDonald's thought coming through. Right away begin to say, oh, this is bold. So yeah, right from the beginning we were hooked.
Oh, love it. And for you, Jenni, I know you shared this in our episode with Thomas, but tell us again how you encountered MacDonald.
So I think it was around when I was 8, somewhere between 8 and 10. We read as a family At the Back of the North Wind, and that just kind of piqued my interest in George MacDonald. We, of course, at that point had many books, and maybe the complete collection that we had for the rest of my growing up years at that point. I wasn't quite ready to read the Scottish romances. They didn't really appeal to me, but I was really intrigued enough that I found The Light Princess and read that next. It fit well. It was just like another fairy tale story, you know, that fit my imagination at the time. And then I started reading the Scottish romances in my last couple years of high school, early years of college. And I think Dad and Mom told me to start with The Fisherman's Lady as well. That rings a bell, that's where I also started. They probably pointed me in that direction. So,
How fun.
yeah.
Can I ask, Jenni, where you're at in the birth order?
I'm first.
Okay.
Yeah, first of 5. Yep.
I'm just picturing, Erik, you with 5 little ones gathered around, one probably crying, one not paying attention.
Most likely, yeah. They're all boys under me, so I'm the only girl, and then there are 4 boys. So it was equally as what you're picturing.
Yeah. And it varied a little bit across the years as the kids got older, but either family story time all together or story time one at a time with kids as they get ready for bed was sort of always a thing. But a number of books that we read all together with the kids. Kind of lined up on the couch was the way that went. Couch, everybody, either mom or dad in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so sweet. What a beautiful picture. Yeah, what a hopeful vision for so many young parents today, I hope, right? So, Jenni, my next question to you specifically is, what was it like growing up with that awareness? And I suppose it might be akin to the fish being in water, not realizing that there's actually other things besides water in the universe.
Yeah, that was actually exactly how I was going to answer this question.
Whoops, sorry.
It's like asking the fish about water, because I don't know that I could even imagine my life without George Macdonald. It's just so integral to my thinking and my approach to basically everything. I think he's just kind of worked his way into just about everything. But one of the things when I was thinking about this was just this concept of growing up around really good story that was very impactful to me. And that wasn't limited to George Macdonald. As my dad just said, we read a wide range of things. You know, we had The Lord of the Rings in there and The Hobbit. We had George Macdonald. And just a constant influx of story, but story with the understanding that this isn't just entertainment. This is actually gold for living life. You know, these are keys to nobility and courage and adventure and honor that actually can play out in your day-to-day life. And I think that set me up to then, when I read George Macdonald, to just understand and appreciate to a whole new level this idea of, wow, here are these characters and these stories and these truths that aren't just entertainment for me. These are actual gems that I can take into my life and apply to lots of different things.
Thank you so much. So now, Erik, as you referenced the work of Michael Phillips, previous guests on this podcast have talked about the era of the 1960s and 70s, the limited availability of McDonald's work, and Phillips, being really quite a vanguard of bringing McDonald's out into the open for our generation and beyond. I'm curious if, first of all, like your background, or did you study English or literature? Was that your major? Were you just a reader? How did it come to be? And did you have any other friends who were into McDonald during the early years of your marriage and parenting?
So first, a little background. No, wasn't studying literature, but had always loved. I'd always loved to read. I loved to read. Oh, always read a lot. And then, interestingly enough, along the way, and it's way too long a story to recount here, but I got redirected into teaching, and then I did do a lot of teaching of English literature. It was kind of a fit. And so, but in those early days, no, there wasn't anybody else. Like, after that year, our little group graduated. We went our separate ways. And I think I went years and years and years of introducing people to McDonald, but never meeting someone who knew who I was talking about. In fact, when I would say, here's some of the most significant authors of my life, and I list George Macdonald always very near the top, if not at the top of that list, people would always go, "Who's he? I've never even heard of him." So a lot of being the one who sort of had the collection. We loaned books. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes we had to buy new ones. But yeah, it's been interesting. And now I've noticed in maybe the last 10 years or so now that occasionally I will run into someone who now has read some George Macdonald. Usually pretty avid fans once somebody gets on board, but still rare, still too few and too far between. So,
Yeah.
I was telling Jenny, there must be other McDonald fans out there, because Bethany House kept releasing these novels. They must have been selling enough of them to make it worth their time.
Right.
So there's got to be other people out there.
Well, we're doing our part here, and
Yes. Good.
I had the privilege of attending a conference in Connecticut in the middle of December of 2024, and Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, who's quite the McDonald scholar, she's just an energetic connector and advocate, and so she spearheaded this conference, and because she had appeared on this series earlier on this podcast, I had the opportunity to go. And she was sharing how, 2024 being the anniversary of McDonald's birth, 200 years since he was born, and coincidentally in my life, my wife's 50th birthday is the same as George's 200th birthday. So we had a special month in December. But Kirsten mentioned that at a conference at Wheaton in May of 24 and a conference in Scotland in November of 24, she collected the email addresses and contact information for over 50 grad students who are doing their thesis or dissertation on McDonald specifically. Very encouraging.
Yeah.
Okay, now, both of you, Jenny, you go first. What is the most beloved work of McDonald that you had in the home growing up?
This is such a difficult question for me to answer because it's really, really hard to pick out one of his works that means more to me than the others. They're all so significant for different reasons. I highlighted The Curate's Awakening on our podcast with Thomas, and that is very, very significant just because of learning to pursue intimacy with Jesus and not as the images we've made of him. I've also been rereading right now the Sir Gibby books. There's 2, and I'm just calling them the Sir Gibby books because for some reason I cannot remember their Michael Phillips titles, even though I'm reading them. But they're just really chock full of so much truth and goodness that I've really, really been enjoying reading through them. And I'm reading through them so slowly because it feels like every page is just worth chewing on for a couple of days. And some of the themes about children and learning and truth, but also just being fully who God made you to be, as humble and as honorable as that is, have really, really been sticking out to me and been so meaningful. So those rank really high right now on the list, although I consider them all fairly equal.
Oh, wonderful. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the character, Sir Gibby?
Yeah. So Gibby is basically a street urchin, and he, through no fault of his own, witnesses a murder, and he's very scared that the murderer is going to come after him because he's witnessed the murder, and so he starts running away, and he goes on quite this journey and meets several different people and has several different adventures, but he ends up in the Highlands of Scotland with this shepherd couple, a husband and his wife, and they're very old, and their children are all grown and kind of living in the area, and they just love Jesus, and teach Gibby about Jesus. And Gibby is this very interesting character in that he's mute. And so he doesn't say anything the whole time, but his expression
Wow.
and the way he does things, MacDonald uses to teach about the innocence of children. And MacDonald often refers to him as being angel-like. So there's kind of this holy presence about him of just this innocence and purity and goodness that Gibby has kind of built into his character from the very beginning, but then with the help of this shepherd couple is cultivated and brought out and is pointed toward Jesus. So that's where the story launches off, and then the series continues with one of those couple's children named Donald, who becomes a tutor at a manor house, and he has his own adventures and mysteries and things, and that's equally profound.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Erik, what was your favorite one to read to the kids, or your favorite one to lean on as a parent of youngsters?
Yeah, I'd have to kind of build on what Jenni said. My favorite one is the collection of all of them.
Yeah.
Because my favorite one tends to be whichever one I'm reading or have reread most recently.
Yep.
Saying to the reader, hey, there's a good chance your understandings of Jesus and the Christian faith are religious in nature rather than personal in nature. What is that? Front that, and the fact that it's accurate, someone who's been to seminary who is doing the awakening is pretty profound and pretty indicative of the depth of George Macdonald's understanding, right? That he can even pull that off as a work of writing is impressive. So I certainly would have listed that one at one point, but there's just so much in each one to recommend. Whether it's the characters that develop, Jenni and I were talking about, they're good stories. I mean, apart from the profound nature of his thought about God and what it means to be human, and what it means to follow Him. That's woven through a really good story.
Yeah.
Some of them are slower. In fact, the one I reread most recently, which wasn't too recent, but not too long ago, The Laird's Inheritance, I reread partly because I had sort of pegged it as maybe my least favorite one in the collection. The stories were pretty slow, I thought, to get started. And then I reread it and I went, man, I don't know what I was thinking. The story's great. It's intriguing. There's these great characters. I don't know what my problem was whenever I developed those initial opinions of it. So it's also fun to go back and revisit them. But there's little bits and pieces, little pieces of characters that stick out from all of them. And so it's been a blessing to have the whole collection, or at least a significant chunk of it. I lost track of whether we had actually obtained every one that came out, but it's a pretty wide bookshelf that houses our George Macdonald collection.
Oh, that's wonderful. So inspiring. Now, as we turn inward, so to speak, in the relationship to one another as father and daughter, daughter to father, would there be any ideas or thoughts of MacDonald that you would say were particularly meaningful, beneficial to the relationship that you two have with one another? And I imagine, Erik, like you, I have multiple children, and my firstborn is also a girl. So I'm just curious as to that dynamic between the two of you and the work of MacDonald in your hearts. If you'd speak to that, Erik.
Yeah, again, it's as Jenni and I talked about this question a little bit ahead of time, and it's hard to point towards something specific, because what comes to mind is more these overall themes, I think, that run through MacDonald's work, that as I read them, the Lord used to build on other themes that had already been in my life, either for good or ill, and so shape my whole thinking as a young adult. Because I would have been about 21, going on 22, when I started reading MacDonald, and so all through my 20s, having my thinking shaped by his writing and his thinking about who God is and who we are. And so it's things like, having this thought, this realization, this understanding that my children are not pets. They're not mine. They're not. I don't in any sense own them. I don't in any sense get to dictate their thriving in the Lord, except to try to contribute to it, right? My goal is to provide for them. My goal is to try to raise them well. My goal is because so in my field in Christian education, we talk all the time about kids being made in the image of God. Well, for me, even as a young man, that was becoming more and more real all the time as I read McDonald and thought about it, looked at my kids, thought about my role as a dad. Which is, see, there's a whole nother thread right there. George Macdonald's understanding of God as our Father,
Yes,
was absolutely mind and spirit altering for me. I sort of grew up in the church. My parents became born again Christians when I was 11 or 10. I made my own commitment to the Lord when I was 11. So from sort of then on, early teens on, I was involved in youth group. So was getting really good teaching in a lot of ways. But something about McDonald's perspective of God as Father was, I think, fundamental to my understanding of what it means to be a father to my children. And so I wanted my kids to exercise their own agency in the world, and their own relationship with the Lord, and their own pursuit of what He would have for them. So the illustration I still use with the team at school is our job is to help kids unwrap the gifts that God's given them, right?
Nice.
Figure out what they are. And it's not up to us to tell them which way to go,
No.
but it's rooted in my reading of George.
Yeah, well, I think that's very helpful. And as I learned recently, so your son-in-law, Jenni's husband, Thomas, is assisting me with some of the production for this podcast endeavor, and discovering a little bit of the demographic of our audience so far, at least on YouTube, quite a few younger men. And so I think there is a desperate desire for insight into being a meaningful, present father for so many people. And I'm sure as you encounter that across the dimensions of the student body at your school, I think of some of the unspoken sermons with really directly unpacking what you're talking about, the conception and understanding of God as Father, and following that pattern in our own lives. So I really appreciate that, Erik. How about you, Jenni?
I think what Dad was talking about just was very evident in our family culture as we were growing up, and specifically in my one-on-one relationship with him. It just felt like a place where there weren't a bunch of expectations about how I had to show up. And so in that sense, it was safe just to be myself and to not feel like I had to jump through hoops to be loved or accepted in the family. And then also this idea that, I was gifted in a specific way and would, because of how I was designed, have a vocation with the Lord, but not like a specific career, but just a living into who He made me to be was my vocation. And as we were talking about McDonald, and one thing that will probably come up again in this conversation later on is this idea that humans are valuable and lovable just by being, not by doing. And that was very much the case in our family. I feel like all 5 of us are very different people, and we very much love everyone for who they are uniquely and individually in our family. And everyone just has their little niche in our family for who they are. So that was very, very apparent. There wasn't like, you need to do XYZ with your life or make so much money or anything like that. It was more of a shepherding of, let's figure this out together, as we're walking with God together on this road. And that just lends itself to a very safe family culture growing up, because you don't feel like you're having to perform. You feel like you can just figure out life and figure out what you believe and who you're going to be while still being accepted at the same time.
Man, it's really, really sweet. I really appreciate you all sharing it. It's probably a little tender for me with the transitions that are underway in my household of young adults.
Yeah.
And
That's rough, isn't it?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
wonderful because that's why we do the work of parenting, so the kids can launch. But man, yeah, there were been more than a few tears with Jenny's mom and I at the kids' launch. Not because we didn't want them to,
right,
just
right.
because the chapter closes and the story's so good. You don't want to turn the page and close that chapter. You just want it to keep on going.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
that hits home, Eric. That hits
yeah.
home. Well, yeah, it's beautiful. It's inspiring. I do believe coming through such a tumultuous epoch in society, that the desire for the family, the familial, the communal is stirring in
Mhm.
the younger generation. At least that's my hopeful look on things. And I'm curious, as you lead a private Christian school, Eric, not only the ideas from McDonald, I might just throw this in there, just kind of your thoughts generally on the family and the future, if you don't mind.
Well, I think you're right, Derek. I think that the really hopeful thing that um, a lot of young parents who are hungry for building quality. So it is a hopeful time. We keep brainstorming as a school team to try to say, hey, how do we offer more robust support to our parents? Obviously, we're trying all the time to offer very robust support and encouragement to our students. That's kind of always on the table.
Uh, Jenny, what are the ways in which McDonald influences your vocation and uh, that other part of your life that is needs to be elevated in the common discourse, and that is caring for those beautiful three boys?
Yeah. I would actually call that my vocation.
Yes. Well,
Not
I
just,
didn't want to speak for you.
thank you. Um, I I very much view that as my central life mission right now, and everything else is kind of peripheral. We have, this very, very, very small amount of time to build our family unit and our family culture. And so it kind of feels, both for Thomas, my husband, and I, all hands on deck, all time and focus into doing this while our boys are at home and growing up. And again, it's hard to pull out specific things that McDonald does because he's so influential to everything. And I think if I could convey that to anybody, it would be that he just influences everything. That whole collection of his work just is applicable to most things in life. But one of the things that's been standing out from these books that I've been reading about Sir Gibby is this idea of tilling up the soil in a person's heart for truth and for Jesus by exposing them to beauty and to good art and to good literature. And that's a pretty common theme in MacDonald's works. And kind of right alongside of that, this character Donald, who becomes a tutor, doesn't teach, looking for the right word, he doesn't tell his pupil, this is what's right and this is what you need to do. He asks a ton of questions to cause the pupil to think on his own and to come up with these questions from his own heart, even though they're the same questions he was trying to have this is a boy he's tutoring in this story to arrive at. And so there's very much this idea, especially as we're homeschooling our boys, of exposing them to really good story, really good art, really good literature, really good information that's high quality. And what I was talking about before, these epic stories that just provide so much insight into being a man or a woman of character and nobility, and a man or a woman who follows Jesus. And then, so exposing them to all of that, and then continuing to just dig in and ask those questions and help them become boys who can think through things and question things on their own and arrive at the contents of their heart. Because I think that's what those questions do for us, right? Is as we ask questions of ourselves, instead of being preached at, we arrive at the contents of our heart. And then that's what creates that like tilling of the soil for the good seed of the gospel, because everything's aerated and broken up and exposed to light and is fertile and ready for Jesus to come in and the Holy Spirit to come in and bring his truth and light. And so I would say that's a huge, huge component of just my day-to-day working with them and my day-to-day relationship with them. You know, I'm with them all the time and more often even than Thomas is. And a lot of the content of our days right now is focused on school as we're in the middle of the school year. And so it's a lot of reading and learning and questions anyway.
Oh, that's great. I could listen to you talk about it for much longer. Sorry. I think, yeah, boy, it's just, it's fascinating how, for me, McDonald's portrayal of the child is so beautiful, perhaps sometimes a little too flawless in
Right.
terms of what the child's heart is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm reminded of that Chesterton quote in which he talks about, we have sinned and grown old, but our Father is younger than we, right? And that wonder that remains in the child's heart as long as we don't stifle it, and how beautiful that you're doing that.
Yeah, we just got to go through Christmas with a 5-month-old, which is probably one of the most magical ways to do Christmas. Not only as a reflection of the Christ child and thinking through Jesus, like God himself being that, but
Yeah.
also just seeing Christmas lights and Christmas trees through the eyes of a 5-month-old is just so fun, because these things that have been around year after year for those of us who are older, are to him are so novel and new, and he can just spend the longest time just touching one light bulb on one light strand on the Christmas tree. And that kind of wonder and childlikeness just is so beautiful, and something that I think Thomas and I are always trying to recapture in our own approach to life. Instead of having grown old and grown tired of repetition, which is the great part of that quote. That's just like my daily life is do it again,
Yes.
and which is that G.K. Chesterton quote. We grow tired of the child saying do it again to us because we're too old. But the Father is saying to the sunrise and to the daisy, do it again, do it again, do it again. So
Yeah.
it's such a great insight into the Father's character.
Erik, this wasn't part of my questions I said send over, but were you able to have any of the grandkids around you for Christmas morning, and what was it like?
Yeah, not this year. We have been able to do that before, but this year they were all at their own places. But Jenni and Thomas and the boys were just here for 5 days, I think, after Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's. So we just got to enjoy Charlie's awe and sense of wonder. And Judah and Aiden are hilarious too. And I mean that in a very bright and loving way. I don't mean that they're ridiculous.
Yeah.
They're just tons of fun to see who they are and see, what their gifts are, even at the age they are now. So yeah, we were very blessed to have them for a little time.
So sweet.
Really quiet.
Right.
Not quiet.
No little feet running around.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I'd love for both of you, and maybe Erik, you could chime in as well from the grandfather's perspective. But with those listening or watching this who have young children or young grandchildren, and still, as you point out, Erik, so many people have yet to hear really about McDonald. Why would you recommend they check out his work, and where should they start?
Ooh, yeah. As to why, I think to reshape understanding of fatherhood, of perfect fatherhood, of fatherhood the way it ought to be, to give us hope that that's actually real in the cosmos, so to speak. That's who God is, and then I think to have that hope that we can aspire to be like Him in that way, recognizing we'll never achieve perfection in that regard. But yeah, I think so. So fathering, parenting, reassurance of your own child's heart that you, in fact, are loved beyond. One of the things about reading McDonald's when I'm having these little babies being born, in my 20s, and I'm starting to think, and this is still true today, there's nothing this kid could do that would make me stop loving her. It's impossible to imagine. It doesn't matter. She's my daughter. She's begotten of the Father, so to speak, in an earthly way. And so there's nothing there. It's impossible to imagine a scenario in which, I might get irritated with her. I might, especially when she was younger, wish she would make a different set of decisions than the ones I could see being made. But in terms of reassuring your own heart, your own child's heart, that you in fact are loved beyond your imagination. My pastor has a way of saying, "Cheer up! You're loved way more than you can imagine. You're also way worse than you are." You know what I mean? So that's why where to start. I still would recommend The Fisherman's Lady as an accessible way to begin the novels. And then I almost think parents should read some of McDonald's work first, maybe before they try to read something to their kid, because I think it helps to have a little bit of your own understanding of maybe where McDonald's is going. Oddly enough, his fantasies and children's works are not my top favorites of his, and it's not that they're not good; they are. But we had read a lot of George Macdonald before we read Back to the Northwest. And even then, Jenny and I were talking about that. Even then, I'm still not entirely sure I know what it is he's doing in that story. So, but
well, I just love the character's name Diamond. So
you're right. Yeah.
How about you, Jenny?
So I think there's a little bit of George Macdonald for every personality. Thomas and I talked about this a little bit last time with you, that if you're not a fiction reader, there is plenty of nonfiction works, especially unspoken sermons. Discovering the Heart of God, I don't know who did that collection, but that's just a great bite-sized collection of his works to get exposed to. Or if you are someone who really loves fantasy and fairy tale, you could start there. If you're going to start with his Scottish novels, Dad and I were talking about this, please just commit to reading the whole thing from start to finish. It's not structured like fiction is anymore today, and it's not written like fiction is anymore today. And so there's a bit of like a palate cleansing that needs to happen almost, if that makes sense, where if you have just been reading like current contemporary fiction, it's going to feel really slow and really boring. The arc of current contemporary fiction is very fast compared to George Macdonald. And just commit to reading it all the way through is what I would ask people to do, because by the end, you will have grown immensely spiritually through his truth. You will also have gotten entranced with the story. Like, I don't know that you can get to the end of one of his books and not get into the story at the end. They're really good stories. They really are. They just develop at a different pace than stories in 2024 develop. And so by the end, you'll have enjoyed the story, you'll have grown a ton, and you'll be ready to read a bunch more George Macdonald. Like this, I've seen people do this, person after person that I've recommended this to. This is what happens. People who read George Macdonald don't stop at one book and say, I didn't like him. I don't know anyone who's ever done that. Yep. Usually once people read one George Macdonald, they're like, oh my gosh, this person is amazing. I need to read more.
If they finish it. Why Jenny's point is so important, because I have recommended it to a few people who came back and said, oh, I just couldn't get through it. And it's like, oh, don't give up.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Jenny's point is spot on. Yeah. There's a little bit of dare I almost say it, discipline.
Yeah.
That first through. And just saying, I'm going to do this. It's going to be fun in the end, but Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird that Chesterton comes to mind again, but in his ode to MacDonald in 1905, I think it was in the London Times, upon MacDonald's passing, he describes reading MacDonald as akin to walking across the field and stumbling upon buried treasure. So, like just nuggets that are so profound and so mind-blowing, breathtaking, however you want to describe it. It's like, oh, I've got to keep going because in 10 more pages there's going to be a line that's just going to absolutely be transcendent for me.
Yeah, and that's a great picture of it, because if you stand at the edge of the field and just look across it, you don't see the treasure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You're not gonna find it till you just commit to, I'm gonna go on the hike.
Yeah.
Right. I gotta do the hike. I gotta move and get into it and find what's there.
Good.
Amazing treasures there.
Oh, well, this has been so fun. I'm so pleased and honored to get to know you both, and have just enjoyed this conversation tremendously. And now we have your final thoughts on George MacDonald with respect to childhood parenting, and I would say as extension of that, Erik, as an educator of children.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a bit hard to separate out specific things, because George MacDonald formed a large part of my early adult thinking. He's a thinker with few peers. But out of all that, I would say, yeah, innumerable chapel messages, classroom conversations, and conversations with my own kids, all centered around a lot of those themes. And so trying to help myself and my children and my family, my school kids, understand that when God gives us boundaries, whether they are individual boundary giftings for us, or whether they are the boundaries of his morality, his ethics, whether they're good for us. It isn't, picture of the children playing in the muddy ditch, where behind them the father of the estate is offering them childhood on the estate, has never left me. So I think overall, that's the piece from George MacDonald that stuck with me for a life.
Perfect. And Jenni, your final thoughts?
Well, my dad brought up about my favorite Bible verse right now that I can't get away from in conversation. So now I feel like we could do a whole nother podcast episode on that.
Works for me if it works for you.
But this idea of being who God made us to be within the limits that he created for us. And those boundary lines aren't just external, they're also internal in terms of character and giftings and strengths and weaknesses, right? We are able as individual people to do different things than anyone else can do. I can't do things my husband can do. He can't do things I can do, just by nature of who we are. And this idea of living fully into that and resting in that, I think that's the piece that I keep coming back to, is how much rest and peace there is to just be who God created you to be, doing what God created you to do. And that is every character in all of the stories of MacDonald, who is a character to emulate. They are doing what God made them to be and doing what God made them to do, not because they're trying to earn his love, and not because they're trying to puff themselves up, but because they are already loved, and because they're resting in this idea of, I have a loving Father who made me this way, so this must be the best possible thing for me right now here. And so back to the Sir Gibby books, this couple who are shepherds are just living this super humble, quiet existence. They are just tending sheep and doing their household chores and reading their New Testament. They're not doing anything else. And our culture has kind of created this idea of this super Christian who's supposed to have all these ministries and be evangelizing on the streets and leading 10,000 people in a church. And there's just this like big and better and very, very public and very, very outward, have a face, have a following, all of that stuff. And there's nothing inherently bad in any of that, except that there's so much rest and quiet in what God has made us to do. And so it is George Macdonald who allows me to look at my life and say, my kids are my vocation. My cultural moment says that's a waste of time, or a waste of my life. And I should be spending more time on my side business or whatever, or more time getting followers and less time with my children. But George Macdonald, his influence over me and my thinking, it says, no, this is where God has put me, and these are the sheep God has placed in the enclosure with me, if you will, who are slightly younger than me. And so this is it for me. And the more I press into that, and it's almost like this idea of like curling up and getting smaller and cuddling up to the Father. The more I curl up and trust in him and rest in him and allow him to be the big one and not me, life just gets so much more restful and joyful and peaceful in that enclosure, in his boundary lines. And I can't think of a better example or better ways to learn about that than reading MacDonald, honestly.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word legacy. Legacy, Legacy. The word legacy, as defined in my Oxford Dictionary, or whatever it is that Google pulled up for me right here on this screen just below the camera, that definition is an amount of money or property left to someone in a will. That's the first definition. That doesn't comport much deep emotional resonance for me. Number two, the long-lasting impact of particular events, actions that took place in the past or a person's life. That's the definition that I'd prefer to focus on for today's sponsorship, because I think it's indicative of our times that, number one, the first definition is the money that you're receiving in an inheritance. And I understand that's a component of legacy. Certainly, everyone wants to provide for their family and their progeny, their heirs. But I think in respect to the conversation that was just had with Erik and Jenni, talking about the culture in the home and the love of reading and the stories of George Macdonald, that's a kind of legacy that echoes and redounds for generations to come. And that's the kind of legacy that I'm most inspired by. Again, consistent action and behavior that reinforces something that leads a person and a family to a specific way of being. And I think as I'm looking down here, I've got a George Macdonald book from his Unspoken Sermons, Love Thy Neighbor. And he says, the two truths by which man lives are love to God and love to man. And the whole system of divine education as regards the relation of man and man has for his end that a man should love his neighbor as himself. That is the truest legacy that we all can leave, that we would love our neighbors as ourselves. So I want to encourage you as you go about your day and your summer vacation plans or whatever it is that's happening for you, that you consider thoughtfully the kind of legacy that we are leaving behind. Not just with those who are closest to us and our family, of course that's a priority, but as we move throughout each day and the people we encounter, are we bestowing a legacy of kindness? Are we bestowing a legacy of humility and service? And most of all, one of love. I am so grateful that we get to continue to have these conversations, and I am just jazzed that Legacy is our sponsor today. Thank you, Legacy, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.